Finally made it to page 2 on your sheet tonight. There's a possibility that we won't get to the last section on the sheet tonight. If we do, we'll simply introduce it, maybe give an overview of it, and then hit the ground running. The difficulty is there are some difficult passages at the end of chapter 3 that we probably, if we're actually going to dig deeper, we probably need to give some consideration to. Although they seem to be footnotes in the letter itself, that they're not explaining the overall purpose. So I don't want to take up a lot of our time with it. But when we get there, we'll spend a little bit of time, in particular, talking about the idea of baptism being an antitype and of Jesus preaching to the souls that are in prison. Those are two things that we struggle with as Bible students sometimes of explaining. And so I don't want to leave those out, but I'll just tell you now that we might just give a brief overview of that thought and move on when we get there. We're in the middle of talking about our need to submit. Now we have moved on to chapter 3, and now in verses 1 through 7, we're told to submit to the needs of our spouse. Submit to the needs of your spouse. I'm not going to make any assumptions about this. I'm just going to say that he spends 6 verses talking about the wife submitting to the husband, and then he spends 1 verse talking about the responsibility the husband has to his wife. However, I think there's actually more commanded information in verse 7 alone than all the 6 verses of the woman's instruction, and we'll talk about why that's there and why it's laid out that way. He says, likewise, as he opens this phrase, if you go back into the text just to make a literary connection, he is then saying that in the same way that masters or slaves are to submit to their masters, then wives are to submit to their husbands. But don't miss the import of the likewise in verse 7. Now he doesn't add the words be submissive like he does in verse 1, but he says likewise. And so servants and masters, you obey God this way. Likewise, wives, you obey God this way. Likewise, husbands, you obey God this way. And so no one is more responsible for their side of it than any other, but no one is less responsible. Do what God says in these given situations. And so he starts with this responsibility of the wife to husband. He tells her to be submissive. This is an action. This is an action. You actively submit. Now, what you will not find in Scripture, in any of these relationships, you will not find the command on part of the one who's in authority to make someone be in submission. Okay? And I think that's extremely important when we consider this. Slaves or masters were never told, get your slaves in submission. Husbands were never told in Scripture, get your wives in submission. Sometimes we read these passages, and I say we as a society, not as a church, and not as a mature thinking people, but we see these passages being interpreted to mean that men have some type of dominant role to force their desire and their will and their agenda in the life of their wife, and that he is to put her in her place. The New Testament never teaches that. Never teaches that. In fact, I think that the responsibility lies upon the one who's submitting, not the one who is over. And because of that, then, if you live in a home, husbands, where your wife does not submit, you must then deal with the choice that you made. It's on her. And wives, if you are married to someone who doesn't submit to your needs, doesn't love you like Christ loved the church, then you will live the choice that you make. But you cannot force him into being what he's supposed to be. Because here's the thing. It's all a microcosm, an illustration of our relationship with Jesus. And he does not force our submission. He does not put down his authoritative hand and say, you will act like this and you have no other choice. If Christ gave us free will in our relationship to make the wrong choice, we must then give the same free will in relationships that we have. Wanting that person to make the choice that God wants them to make, because that's the best for our home. But I then cannot demand or coerce that submission. And I really think that's what a lot of this is. The word for submission here is the word meaning to arrange under. It's a military term. It's the idea of organizing a company of men and putting them in their right place. In a non-military use, it means this: a voluntary attitude of giving in. A voluntary attitude of giving in. A spirit of cooperation. Now, I don't know if you've ever collaborated with anyone on a particular project. I have a time or two over the years when it comes to planning certain things. I've been able to work with Patrick here lately on some things. And I will, without question and without hesitation, defer and submit to Patrick when it comes to concepts and ideas and design for graphics. I'll do that. And here's why. Because he's skilled in that. He's been blessed with that talent, and I have not. And so I will submit to that. It's understanding the value and place that someone has. And when I understand the value and place someone has, I really have no problem submitting. I really don't argue with that. I don't assume that I know better. But our world doesn't really act like that sometimes. Husbands know exactly how their wives ought to think, and they ought to function, they ought to be. And so he forces what he thinks she ought to be on her from a male side of things. And the wife has all the answers for how a husband is supposed to react and act and do and be and live. And so she forces that onto him. Realize, ladies, if you were going to be the husband and fulfill that function, God would have made you the husband. He did not create you to think like your husband or for him. And men, if God wanted you to be the wife in the relationship, He would have made you a woman. You do not know the abilities and the thought processes and the desires of the female persuasion. And you're not supposed to in that fashion. She is created to function the way God's created her to function, and you to force what you think she ought to be on her and to be is a violation of these passages. You let her be what she is to be, and you be what you're supposed to be. Now, as he gives this term, he fleshes out this idea by giving a command. He says to submit to your own husbands. By the way, he does not require women in every situation as a general rule to submit to every man. And I think that needs to be said, because we have a faction, even within the church, who will suggest and teach that women can have no authoritative role. They mean by that no role in government, no role in a school system over men, that she is to always be in subjection. Listen, this passage says that she is to be in subjection to whom? Her own husband. Period. Now, there are some other situations where she will submit to a man. For example, the elder member relationship, she'll submit to those men. The government, if the king or governor is a man, she will submit. But the general practice in the worship assembly, when a man is to lead and she is to be in a submissive role, but as a general rule in life, it is not demanded in all relationships that be the case. And so he's very deliberate and specific with his words. She is to submit to her own husband. Then the next phrase in verse 3, we get the understanding of why this is in here. We learn that the relationship actually being described is a relationship between a Christian woman and a non-Christian man. Now, I would ask you, why would a non-Christian man not be submitted to by a Christian woman? What might be the reasoning for that?
If he's not going to search to obey God.
Okay, in the cases where she would not have to follow would be if he says, listen, you can't serve the Lord. And I'm gonna keep you from serving the Lord, and so she must follow him. That's actually not the question, but that's a great answer. The question I was asking, and I know I delivered it very unclearly. I realized it when I said it. Why might she believe she didn't have to submit even when she should?
Because he's not a Christian.
Because he's not a Christian. Her master is Jesus, right? And his master is the devil. Because it's only one of two. You only serve one master, and you will always serve one master. And so since I belong to Christ and he doesn't, then I'm not obligated to submit to him. It's the same argument the slave would make for the master, or the subject in a kingdom might make for his king. She might make that. She might believe it. In fact, she might believe, going back to the 1 Corinthians 7 argument, that being married to a non-Christian defiles her. And so if she follows the headship of a non-Christian, then is she forsaking Christ? And so I'll shirk this responsibility, I'll let go of his authority, and I won't submit to him. He says, no, you submit, remember the first point we made? Because he may actually be won to Christ through your submission. Now, I don't know if you have a story in your past, but I have a few in mind. My wife's aunt was married to a non-Christian. And not just a non-Christian, but a belligerent non-Christian who was convinced he would break her of her Christianity. They lived about a mile down a gravel road that led to the main road, and he worked a lot on Sundays. And so a lot of Sundays he would take the only car they have, and he would drive it to the end of the road and park it, and then meet someone and ride with them to work so she wouldn't have a car to go to worship in on Sunday. And so she'd take the two small children they had, and she'd load them up on the tractor, and she'd drive to the end of the road, and she would park the tractor. She would get the car, and she would take the car to worship. She would bring it back. She would leave it there because he wanted it there when he got home. She'd bag on the tractor and drive the tractor back to the house. When that didn't work, he would let all the air out of the tires. And so she would go and air up all the tires and be late for worship. And so then he would throw the keys on top of the house. And then one morning, she was getting up and getting ready, and he wasn't working, and he was getting up and getting ready. She said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I think I'll go to church with you today." That took place for about 6 or 9 months, and then he began to study his Bible, and about a year later he obeyed the gospel. Because she didn't nag, and she didn't fight. She was angry, no doubt. And I'm sure there were times where she showed her frustration, but she maintained her faithfulness, and he was won to Christ because of that. That's what Peter's talking about. Because the overall objective of submission is so that the one who doesn't know God will glorify him the day of visitation. That man may very well glorify God when Jesus returns because of her example that she left for him and gave for him. So you submit to him because his soul is at stake. They may observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. You will win him without a word. Maybe if we were a marriage seminar, we would talk about the negative effects of nagging in the home. And I don't say that to be funny at all, because there are negative effects. She is not going to win him to Christ by browbeating him into going to worship. In fact, she's probably going to do just the opposite. But then he changes gears and he gives us something else. It seems like just this random statement. What does verse 3 say? Somebody? Don't be afraid to read it. You can read it out loud.
Whose adorning let it not be that outward adorning of the plaiting of the hair and of the wearing in the gold, or putting on of apparel.
It seems strange, doesn't it, to you? He's talking about the way she'll win him to Christ, now that she shouldn't nag him, that her good, positive example will be that. And he says, now don't doll yourself up. If you want to modernize the vernacular there, don't fancy your appearance. Don't wear makeup and fix your hair and put on nice clothes. And he follows it with this. He says, rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with an incorruptible beauty of gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. Here's the reason this is there. This is not there, by the way, to say that it's wrong for Christian women to wear makeup. There are whole religions that teach that. That it's wrong for a woman to cut her hair. That it's wrong for a woman to wear nice clothes. It's wrong for a woman to look pretty or to want to look pretty. That's not the prohibition here. Remember the context. What's the context? What's she trying to do? Win her husband for Christ, right? Now, she might do that. She might get him in the church building. She might even get him in the baptistry if she nags him. But will it be for her, or will it be for him? Will it be for her, or will it be for Christ? You're not going to accomplish anything by nagging him. He then takes a secondary approach at this, and this is extremely important. You don't seduce him into becoming a Christian. That's the point of this being there. Now, I'm not comfortable saying that, but that's it. The sexual relationship is never to be used as a bargaining chip in a marriage. Ever. For any reason. In fact, I had an instructor in preaching school that would suggest that such was simply marital prostitution. To agree to certain sexual favors for other things outside the sexual realm. I'll leave that up for you to discuss and consider on your own and how you would apply that. But when it comes to obeying the gospel, you don't seduce him into that. Now, what does that look like? I'll just say this. Women have gotten men to do some crazy things over the years because of sexual attraction. Haven't they? I mean, you think outside the realm of the humorous, you think about men who leave families and abandon faith because of sexual attraction. Suppose a woman says, listen, I need my children to have a godly father, and my husband's not a Christian, so I withhold myself from you until you become a Christian. It can happen. We tend to hear it more like this. I'm not going to marry you unless you obey the gospel. Now, we might mean well when we say that. We have a general rule for our children that they date Christians. There's going to come a point when we can't control that decision that they make, but for a time, we get to have a pretty big hand in whether or not that takes place. But that's because our desire is for them to marry a Christian. It's our desire. The last thing I want my girls to do is tell a boy, listen, I can't date you unless you're a Christian. And I can't consider marrying you unless you obey the gospel. Because young men are driven by sexual appetite and desire. And so he may very well obey the gospel simply so that he has the right to date my daughter. That's not the draw of Christianity. Now, sometimes it happens naturally that way, and a person introduces the gospel, they obey the gospel, they remain faithful. I get that. I'm not saying that it may not start and end that way. I'm suggesting that should not be her motive. Not because she doesn't have sexual appeal, but because it should be the inner person of the heart that draws that man. That he sees something different in her. That's been the theme through all of this, right? Something different in a slave who will submit to a harsh master. There's something different about a citizen of a government that oppresses it, that honors that government. Something different about a stranger or a pilgrim not adapting to his new surroundings and still living a separate life. There's something different about a woman who's married to a man who doesn't understand his role, and yet she still loves him and serves him and obeys him, even as Sarah did Abraham, calling him Lord. Of all the commands he's going to give to the man in verse 7, he really just gives one to the woman in verse 6. You live the life you're supposed to live so he can get to heaven. And if you are a spouse, a wife in particular, because that's where we're at, who is not helping your husband get to heaven, please read 1 Peter 3, 1 through 6. Because that's your role. It's a greater role you have than bearing children. It's a greater role than you have of guarding and protecting your home. It's a greater role than you have of being a mother, is to help your husband get to heaven. Now, if a non-Christian wife or a Christian wife can convince her non-Christian husband to obey the gospel through her example, imagine what a Christian wife can do for her Christian husband in spiritual things. And we have a dearth of leadership in our country, and we have a crisis of leadership in the Lord's church. And most of that lies squarely upon the shoulders of men. Some of it lies upon the shoulders of their wives. For not helping them become the person that God would have them to be. Her agenda should be for him to be the best God-fearing man he could possibly be on this earth. That's the responsibility she's given. And so she is to submit to him to make that happen. And then in verse 7, he switches gears. I know we didn't talk a lot about that incorruptible spirit, about the quiet spirit, but there are some things perhaps to be said there, maybe for a different time. He then says in verse 7 to the man, dwell with her, or with them, their wives, with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Several things he says about marriage from the male perspective. We'll quickly point that out. Number one, there is to be habitation in marriage. She is to dwell, or he is to dwell with her. The word literally means to reside together as a family. It's a domestic word. It's the concept of living together. We hear it in the original marriage instruction, don't we? A man shall be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. He will leave father and mother. They will be a family. Now, we usually equate that with leaving home and living in your own house. Don't we? You leave father and mother, you get out, you get your own house, no matter how small it is, no matter what side of town it's on, no matter if everything squeaks when it runs, but you get your own house, you live by yourself. It's not actually what the text is suggesting, because a lot of times in the first century they lived in communal homes and they had a lot of rooms and they didn't always move off property. The idea is that your home be your home and it not be anybody else's. That mom and dad don't have a say in what you do, that you dwell together. It also means that you have to be present to be there. That when you get married, that your friends that you ran around with on Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday night, you don't run around with those friends anymore because you're at home. You're with family. You're together. Doesn't mean you isolate yourself and have no friends. But I tell young folks when they come to talk to me about getting married, his friends become your friends and her friends become your friends. You have friends together now. You don't generally have friends separate. Because you are one. You are dwelling together. So when problems happen and things occur and things get sideways, you stay there. You're not able to work things out. I probably went too far just then, didn't I? You don't work things out by leaving and going somewhere else. You dwell together. There's a domestic habitation. I don't know that we have to tell Christians that. But how easily does the world resolve to separate, to give it a break, to divorce, to go home to mom and dad, to go to a friend's house, to sleep on the couch. You dwell together. There's habitation in marriage. I can't work out the problems and strengthen relationship if I'm not together. Not only that, must dwell together according to knowledge. There must be then education in marriage. Learn her. Now, just like it said to the husband that he or the wife that she had to submit to her own husband, it is then required of husband they know their own wife. Now, I am thankful the Lord did not command me to know all women. It is hard enough to learn one, and to learn then the 4 daughters that He blessed me with, to learn 5. But learn her. And you know what? She's going to be different than any other woman on the face of the earth. And so any past relationship that you have, you don't compare her. And you don't treat her according to those. Maybe the one that maybe should be mentioned most of all is, she's not your mom. And she should not be compared to her, for good or bad. She's her. You learn her. What makes her smile? What makes her sad? And that education becomes your lifeline, because then your marriage will depend on how you use that knowledge. You ever known someone to be offended by something, or to be grossed out by something, or to just be averse to it, and we think that's crazy? You know, in the past few years I've gotten to where I eat sushi. Probably more than I ought to. There are certain people in my family who find that disgusting. And they make it their point to try to convince me that I shouldn't eat that. You know, they're not going to change my mind. That's I don't know that's the right way to say it. That's who I am. I eat sushi. And you're wasting your time. Now take that trivial concept and apply that to the things that may bother your spouse, your wife. Maybe it's the fact that you don't call when you're going to be late for work, or late coming home from work. And a man says, well, I'm the man of the house, and I'm the head of the house, and I'm the one in charge, and I don't owe you an explanation. And I've told you 10 times, if I'm late, I'm on my way home. Okay, act that way. You have learned over the years that bothers her. Why not use that knowledge to your advantage into hers? And honor her with a phone call or a text. It is not about exercising our rights. It is about honoring the other person. You dwell with her according to knowledge, education. You learned her. Number 3, there is to be admiration. This is my favorite description in Peter's writings about marriage. You give honor to her as to the weaker vessel. Now, I suppose that deserves a little bit of explanation. I believe he's talking physically there. Generally speaking, and you can argue with me, I'm sure we all have examples. Generally speaking, in marriages, the stronger physically is the man. But even if she's not, she's to be treated as if she's breakable. That's the image. You know, if you had a precious heirloom that's handed out, a vase that belonged to your great-grandmother, it may not be worth money, but maybe it is. Maybe it's worth $1,000. Maybe it's not worth 10, but it's important to you, right? And you have 3 or 4 small children. What do you do with that vase? You put it up. And maybe you lock it up, right? But you elevate it, you exalt it, you surround it, you protect it. And if you move it from one house to another, what do you do with that? You pack it carefully. You might pack it carefully, put it in a box, put that box in the front seat of the car as you travel. You don't put that in the back of the moving truck. Because that vessel is precious to you. And you know that if it gets chipped or scratched or broken, that it would break your heart. Husbands, give honor to your wife as the weaker vessel. You exalt her in your home. And you put her in a place where she cannot be harmed, where she cannot be dented, where she cannot be broken. You know, I think that in my time as a child, I got in more trouble for the way I talked to my mom than any other thing I got in trouble for. And I felt I was a pretty respectful guy. But you let my voice raise just a notch. You let my look be just a little bit sarcastic. And I still remember the pain of those moments. And it wasn't just simply that he was teaching me how to treat Shani Kay. But he was teaching me that my mom was valuable enough to protect even against the people who loved her the most. That she was not going to be talked down to. I'll never forget, my sister would say a lot of times, she said this, and she didn't mean anything by it. She is a pronoun referencing my mom, and she would get in trouble for not calling my mom by name or calling her mom. As if that was a sign of disrespect. That's how intense my dad would be on protecting my mom. But I learned that, and now we have those same conversations in our house. You know, women can tend to get crossways. Put 5 of them in one house. You don't stand in the crosshairs because you'll get hit. And I love my girls, but I love their mama more. And she will be protected above any and all. Partly because of this passage. She is to be held in great esteem. She is to be treasured above everything. Why? Because we together are heirs of the grace of life. There's a principle here, and I love families. I love talking about the home. Listen, if you are married to a Christian lady, and you are a Christian man, she is your sister in Christ. And she deserves the same treatment and benefit of the doubt and love and affection as everyone else who's a member of the Lord's church. You ever find, husbands, and please don't raise your hand, you ever find that we are far more patient with our Christian sisters than we are our wife? Maybe I should ask it to the wives that are here. Do you feel that way sometimes? I have a good friend. Many of you probably know him, but he calls his wife Sister Owens. That's what he calls her all the time, every time he talks about it. And I asked him why, and he said, because of this passage right here. That one day she calls him Brother Owens. Now, I don't know in the privacy of their home, when they're talking about each other, that's how they refer to each other. And perhaps to strengthen our marriages, we at least should consider that relationship. If not, make it supreme above all else. There must be admiration. And then finally, there must be supplication in marriage. Now, notice, what is the point of all this? Why do we treat each other like this? What's the end of verse 7 say? So that our prayers won't be hindered. Remember, salvation is the goal in all of this, isn't it? It started back from the very beginning of this section, that you give an example to your non-Christian friends so that they can glorify God the day of visitation. You serve your master the way you ought to because it's a representation of your relationship with the Lord. You honor government because God established it. You treat your husband like you should because you want to win him for Christ, and you treat your wife like you should because you want to be able to pray. My dad would often use an illustration or ask a question about Sunday morning worship. You know, Sundays can be some of the most stressful days in a Christian home, especially with children. You try getting children up before they're ready to get up, you get them ready to go to Bible class, get breakfast, get across town, get everybody settled and set in, and a lot of people get to worship already frazzled and angry because they've been fighting. It's time to go, let's leave. You're not going to wear that, are you? Wear your shoes. Don't hit your brother, get your Bible. We have to go back home. We left the meal for potluck sitting on the stove. And the anger and the frustration, and we come in with a smile and we sit down, and the songs we sing and the prayers we offer go no higher than the ceiling because we're not getting along with our families. Don't let your prayers be hindered by your relationship. Rather, let your prayers be enriched because you have done what God said. Submit to the needs of your spouse. And then finally, in this second application section, submit to your fellow Christian. Submit to your fellow Christian. Finally, all of you be of one mind. Lest you think that this responsibility to get along and to honor and to cherish and in affecting your worship only applies to the couples and the families in the church. All of you be of one mind together, having compassion for one another. And then he gives this list. It's almost has a flavor of Paul's writings. Love his brothers, be tenderhearted, be courteous, don't return evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this. And that's not the only time he's going to use that phrase. We didn't read it. He used it before when it came to suffering for Christ's sake in verse 21 of chapter 2. Knowing you're called for this. This is why you have been being built up a spiritual house. This is why you've been saved and you're suffering and God's using that suffering to form you and shape you, because this is your calling. Now, we might make that calling evangelism, and that's part of it. We might make that calling to bring glory and honor to God, and that's the end of it. But notice how practical and simple this is. You've been called to suffer, and in the midst of that, to treat one another like you're supposed to. Remember, we talked at the very beginning of this class about how sometimes external pressures can make brethren turn on one another. It can make us start arguing and fighting and fussing and not getting along and dividing the church. And he says, in the midst of this, as you're struggling with being the people of God, as he's building you up in this spiritual house, as he's chiseling you and sanding you, you return no evil for evil, and you be courteous, tender-hearted, and you love. You show compassion. Because the last thing that God wants to do is he puts pressure on the outside of the house by persecution. There's the house to implode on itself. And yet it happens. Marriages crumble because of external pressure. Churches struggle and crumble because of external pressure. Listen, he's not saying you're not going to struggle. He's saying you're going to struggle, and if you don't withstand the pressure, it's all going to be for naught. Imagine suffering through life only to be lost. Imagine facing the difficulties of life and God sanding you and chiseling you only for the end of it all for you to cave in and not care. Live how you're supposed to live. Do the things that you're supposed to do. Be of one mind. Literally be harmonious. Be harmonious. Have compassion or be sympathetic. Live brotherly, the New American Standard Version says. Be compassionate, tenderhearted. Be courteous or of humble mind. You know, you look at all of these, you could easily go back and run through the list of things you're to add in Colossians 3. And they're going to feel very much the same. You can go through the description of what love is in 1 Corinthians 13. They're going to be pretty much the same. You can go through what the requirement is that Jesus gave for his people to be in the opening of the Sermon on the Mount. And those principles are going to be the same. See, if I submit to everybody around me, and I fix my problems with the government, and I fix my problems with my non-Christian friends, and I fix my problems with my family, and I neglect my relationships in the church, I'll never be what I need to be. You ever take the church family for granted? I don't mean abuse them, and I don't mean that you belittle them. I mean you ever just take for granted the opportunities you have to assemble and to be together. I hope not. I hope not. But I think we see it sometimes in the way that we talk, don't we? How you doing today? I'm good. I'm good. And you're not. And that brother or sister wants to help, and you don't ask for it. You don't share with them. The invitation's extended, and while you may not have sin in your life, you have struggles that you need help with. And James tells us to confess our faults one to another and pray one for another. And we sit silent with our hands folded, and maybe our words mumbling from our mouth, but no one responds to the invitation, and we don't share. You know that you have a church family wherever you are that longs to be all of these things for you. And you know how I know that? Because I know that you long to be that for them. But we bury those things and we hide those things and we neglect the carrying out of those things because we just don't want to be a bother. Listen, we are in the process of being built up as a spiritual house. God is in the process of shaping us and forming us, and sometimes that comes with heartache and it comes with difficulty. It comes with tragedy and heartache. And I can't turn to the world because I'm a stranger and a sojourner and an immigrant. I don't fit there. And I can't turn to the government because they're overly harsh. And I can't turn to a master who treats me the way that I shouldn't. But I know where I can turn. I can turn to those last two. I can turn home and I can turn to my church family. And so then he begins to quote in the remainder of this section Psalm 37. About seeing good days and living life and the things I'm supposed to do, realizing that the Lord cares for His people. As God's spiritual house, may we be a people who submit for the sake of one another, for the sake of the church, but most importantly for the sake of God, that someone who doesn't already might glorify Him in the day of visitation. Now I hope that you'll be back next week, because we're going to move quickly and as thoroughly as possible. And look at the third. The third doctrinal principle is mentioned there on your sheet. There is blessing in suffering as a Christian. If it's true then that salvation is worth suffering for, and you will suffer as you're being perfected, then there's blessing in that. We'll establish that fact very quickly. And then we'll look at the summation of the book, the almost the bullet point fashion as Peter gives us. Because of that, do this, do this. He does that a number of times at the end of the book, and we'll walk through those things. Any questions or comments before we close?
I think you're going to tell us why you must approach the spiritual disobedience.
I will do that next week. It'll be on YouTube. All right?